The courtroom was colder than I expected. The air smelled faintly of paper coffee and perfume that wasn't mine. I stood near the front, clutching a thin folder to keep my hands from shaking. My gray suit, pressed modest, nothing extravagant, felt suddenly heavy under the lights. From the corner of my eye, I saw them, my parents. My mother Elaine in a navy dress that could have paid someone's rent for a month, tilting her head toward my father with that rehearsed half-smile. "She still dresses like she's working for charity," she whispered. "My father?" Robert chuckled, not bothering to lower his voice. "Fitting," he said, "since that's all she's ever been, a charity case." The people behind them laughed quietly. The sound hit harder than I expected. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward, eager for the family drama the headlines had promised. Hayes family v. Hayes, $18 million at stake. I kept my eyes on the wooden table, tracing the grain with my thumb. If I looked at them, I might see the same faces that once clapped at Michael's graduation, the same hands that once fixed my collar before school. But those memories didn't belong here anymore. Judge Margaret Keene entered her robe swaying with quiet authority. The chatter stopped. "Court is now in session." My name echoed in the room like an accusation. Laura Hayes. My mother's shoulders straightened. My father smirked. I knew that look. It said, "She won't last 10 minutes. I took one slow breath, the kind Henry had taught me before my first trial. Breathe through the silence. Let it belong to you. When I raised my head, the courtroom lights hit my glasses, hiding my eyes. I caught their reflection, two faces frozen in condescension, the same faces that had laughed when I left home with nothing but a duffel bag and Henry's house key, the same faces that hadn't visited once in 6 years, not even when he died. Now they were here fighting for the last thing that still carried his name. My pulse steadied. I didn't need their approval. I had evidence. I had truth. I had the patience Henry called justice. Judge Keene adjusted her glasses. "Are both parties ready?" "Yes, Your Honor," said my father's attorney, smiling too broadly. My voice was steady when I answered. "Ready, Your Honor." The words echoed through the courtroom, calm, firm, undeniable. They mocked my outfit, my silence, my restraint. But what they didn't know was that restraint would bury them. I was born into a house that looked perfect from the street, white columns trimmed hedges and glass that gleamed like wealth itself. Inside, though, the air was thick with performance. My father, Robert Hayes, believed in reputation more than empathy. My mother, Elaine, believed in appearances more than truth. And Michael, my younger brother by 3 years, was the center of their small universe, a golden boy molded for the family's legacy. They called me serious, sensitive, too, moral for my own good. When I chose to study law instead of joining the family investment firm, my father laughed across the dinner table. "Law. You want to waste your mind defending criminals. That's charity work, not a career." Elaine stirred her soup without looking at me. "Maybe she just wants to feel important, Robert. Let her try." I remember the sting of those words more than any argument. It wasn't anger. It was dismissal. It was the silence that followed the sound of a spoon clinking against porcelain while I disappeared inside my own home. Michael was the mirror they wanted the world to see. Smiling, confident, groomed for leadership. When he crashed his first car at 17, my father replaced it within the week. When I graduated early, no one came to the ceremony. They sent flowers instead. Lilies with a card that said, "Proud of you. Keep working hard." At 22, I packed my things. My father stood in the foyer, one hand in his pocket, the other on the banister. "You'll be back," he said. "You'll realize life's harder without us." My mother didn't even come down the stairs. The door clicked shut behind me, a sound that stayed in my memory longer than any goodbye. I rented a small apartment near Boston University with peeling paint and a leaky faucet. I took night shifts at a diner and worked weekends as a clerk at a public defender's office. Every time I thought I couldn't afford another month, a white envelope would appear in my mailbox. No return address. Just Henry's familiar handwriting. Presence defines love. He was 74, then freshly retired from the federal bench, still sharp as glass. He never lectured me about leaving home. He only said, "You chose the harder truth. That's how you know it's right. Sometimes he'd visit with takeout coffee and tell me stories from court about lawyers who talked too much and judges who listened too little. He'd end each story the same way: justice isn't about winning. It's about showing up when others don't. I carried those words like a compass. While my parents hosted charity galas and Michael gave speeches about Hayes' integrity, I learned how to fight for people who had no one. The irony didn't escape me. I was defending strangers while my own family was learning how to erase me. But Henry kept me anchored. Every phone call, every letter reminded me that legacy wasn't about the name you inherited. It was about the name you protected. I didn't know it then, but Henry was quietly preparing me for the war my parents would one day start. Childhood in the Hayes household wasn't cruel in the obvious way. It was subtle, like a slow erosion you didn't notice until you looked back and realized you were standing in the hollowed-out part. I was 10 when I first understood what invisibility felt like. My drawing had been chosen to hang in the school library. It was simple, 2 hands holding a scale, but the principal said it showed balance and empathy. I came home with the letter trembling in my hand. Elaine skimmed it, smiled distractedly, and said, "That's nice, honey. Michael has a soccer match this Saturday. Don't forget to cheer." She put the letter down next to the grocery list. It stayed there for weeks, gathering dust. That evening, Henry stopped by for dinner. He saw the paper, read it carefully, then looked at me. "You have an eye for fairness," he said. "The world forgets that balance isn't weakness." He tucked the letter back into my backpack, like it was something worth keeping. I was 12 when I realized my mother didn't hug me anymore. She'd pat my arm instead, like I was a colleague, not a daughter. Michael would race down the stairs, hair tousled and grinning, and she'd beam like he'd just won the Nobel Prize. "That's my boy," she'd say loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The same year I acted in a small school play, 2 lines barely apart, but I had practiced for weeks. They promised they'd come. They didn't. When I peeked out from the stage curtain, I saw one familiar face in the audience: Henry, in his old tweed coat, smiling like I was the entire show. Afterward, he handed me a yellow tulip from his garden. "Not all love is loud," he said. "Some of it just shows up." At 15, Michael got his first car, a silver BMW, brand new bow on the hood. The whole neighborhood gathered in the driveway. My father clapped him on the back, beaming. I handed Michael a card I'd made myself, written in careful ink. "Drive safely. Don't forget who you are." He didn't read it. Elaine laughed, saying Laura's always so sentimental. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but smiled anyway. That night I stayed up studying the laughter from downstairs, echoing through the vents. At 17, I told them I'd gotten an interview for a law scholarship. My father lowered his newspaper just long enough to say, "Law." "You think that's respectable for a girl who can't handle criticism," Elaine added. "It's good to dream, honey. Just have a backup plan." I didn't answer. Henry called later that night. He'd heard from a neighbor that I'd been studying late. "Justice needs people who listen, not shout," he said. "You'll do well." When I got the scholarship letter, I didn't tell my parents. I packed it quietly into a folder with Henry's notes and his old fountain pen. By 22, the silence at home was so constant it started to hum. I told them I was moving out. My father stood in the foyer, hand on the banister, like he was watching a maid leave. "You'll come back when life reminds you you're not special," he said. Elaine didn't even look up from her magazine. Henry came by the next morning, placed a small brass key in my palm. "It's to the old apartment near Charles Street," he said. "It's not much, but it's yours if you need it." I tried to thank him, but he shook his head. "Presence defines love," he repeated. I didn't cry until I closed the door behind me. It wasn't the leaving that hurt, it was knowing they wouldn't notice I was gone. By the time I turned 30, Henry had grown slower, his steps measured and careful, but his mind was still sharper than anyone I'd ever met. He'd retired completely by then, his name printed on a small brass plaque that now gathered dust in his study. He moved into my apartment that summer after a minor fall, left him wary of the stairs in his old house. "Don't look at me like I'm dying," he said when I helped him unpack. "I just need someone to remind me to eat vegetables." We fell into a rhythm almost immediately. I'd come home from the public defender's office near midnight, drop my bag on the couch, and find him half asleep in his recliner with a book on his lap. He'd wake up, adjust his glasses, and ask, "Did the world behave today?" I'd answer, "Barely." Then we'd both laugh. On Sundays, we played chess at the kitchen table, mugs of tea between us. He never let me win. "Justice isn't about mercy," he'd say as he captured my queen. "It's about order." After every game, he'd write down what move had changed the tide and underline it twice. He called it recording the truth. Those pages would one day become part of the evidence I'd submit in court, though I didn't know it yet. There was a peace in that small apartment that no expensive house had ever given me. Sometimes he'd look out the window at the neighbor's dog or the street musicians below and say softly, "The law only matters when it remembers people like them." His words shaped the way I worked. I took pro bono cases, defended women who'd been cheated by landlords, elderly men accused of petty theft, people who'd been forgotten by everyone else. My parents never asked about my cases. They still sent Christmas cards with printed signatures and family photos that didn't include me. I kept them unopened in a drawer. Henry noticed but never commented. One evening after dinner, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a document naming me his legal guardian should his health decline. I looked up, startled. "Are you sure?" I asked. "You have a son." He smiled faintly. "I have a granddaughter who shows up." I didn't know it then, but that moment drew the invisible line that would divide our family forever. Over the next 6 years, I became his caretaker, making breakfast, managing medications, sitting through long nights when pain kept him awake. He'd apologize, and I'd shake my head. "You were there when no one else was." I'd remind him. "This is easy." It wasn't, but I meant it. He'd rest his hand on mine, fragile and trembling, and say, "Justice isn't loud, Laura. It's the proof that endures." Those words would echo through my mind in the courtroom years later when silence became my weapon. Henry died quietly on a Thursday morning in late September. The sky was clear. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. I found him in his chair by the window glasses, still on book open in his lap. There was no struggle, no noise, just stillness. He'd always said he wanted to go mid-sentence, and somehow he did. For a long time I couldn't move. The apartment felt like it had lost gravity. I called the ambulance, then sat on the floor beside him until they came, my hand resting on his. It was still warm. The funeral was held at St. Mark's Cathedral in downtown Boston, crowded with judges, clerks, and lawyers who'd worked beside him decades ago. Everyone spoke about his integrity, his fairness, his belief that justice was an act of patience. My parents sat in the front row like they'd earned the right to mourn him. My mother wore black silk and pearls. My father shook hands with reporters outside, using the attention like oxygen. Michael wasn't far behind, comforting Elaine theatrically, the model's son consoling the grieving mother. I stood alone in the second row, the only one who actually knew where Henry kept his glasses when he read or how he hummed while making tea. After the service, a man in a charcoal suit approached me. "Miss Hayes," he said, extending a card. "I'm Attorney Clifford. Your grandfather asked that I contact you regarding his will." My father's head turned sharply. "His will," he repeated, as if the word itself were an insult. The reading took place a week later at Clifford and Monroe, an old brick office that smelled of leather and paper. The family gathered around a long oak table. The air was tight, rehearsed, expectant. Clifford cleared his throat. "Judge Henry Hayes prepared this document 6 months prior to his passing of sound mind and witnessed by 2 parties. Robert leaned back, arms crossed, confident. Elaine smiled thinly. Then the lawyer began to read. "To my son Robert Hayes and his wife Elaine, I leave my collection of antique law books in the hope they one day read them." Elaine's smile faltered. "To my grandson Michael Hayes, I leave the painting from my study because every empire deserves a portrait." A small laugh rippled from Michael's side of the table. Then came the line that froze the room. "To my granddaughter, Laura Hayes, who showed up when others vanished, I entrust my estate, my home, and the management of the Henry Hayes Justice Fund. She has been the truest expression of my name." My father's hand gripped the armrest until his knuckles whitened. Elaine whispered, "That can't be right." The lawyer continued reading Henry's final paragraph aloud. "Legacy is not what you pass down in wealth, but in witness. She witnessed me. My mother's face went pale. Michael exhaled sharply, muttering, "He must have been manipulated." I said nothing. I kept my gaze on this document as if it were still breathing alive with his handwriting. Afterward, when everyone filed out, Clifford stopped me by the door. "He was proud of you," he said you never traded your silence for approval. Outside, the autumn wind cut through my coat. My parents stood by their car whispering. My father glanced over his shoulder, his eyes cold and deliberate. I knew that look. It was the same one he gave business rivals before he sued them, the same one he gave me the night I left home. Grief hadn't softened him, it had only sharpened his sense of ownership. In that instant, I realized the fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The first letter came exactly 4 weeks after the funeral. It arrived in a heavy cream envelope stamped with the Hayes family crest, ironic, considering I was still legally the only one entitled to use it. Inside was a summons. My parents were suing me for undue influence and mental manipulation, claiming I'd coerced Henry into changing his will while he was emotionally vulnerable and cognitively impaired. My hands shook as I read it. The words bled together. Fraud, duress, incapacitation. My father had signed his name in thick blue ink, bold and deliberate, the same signature he used on contracts that destroyed competitors. It wasn't grief that drove them, it was greed dressed as righteousness. I called their attorney, Gregory Sloan, hoping to talk sense into someone, but he refused to speak with me directly. "All communication must go through counsel," his assistant said coldly. "Your parents are confident in their claim." Confident. That word burned. Within days, the tabloids picked up the story. Headlines sprawled across local news. "Estranged daughter inherits millions." "Family. Cries foul." Reporters camped outside my apartment asking if I'd manipulated an old man. Even some of my colleagues avoided eye contact in the courthouse hallways. By the end of the week, the firm where I worked placed me on temporary leave to avoid a conflict of image. I packed my office in silence. The only person who didn't flinch was Anna Reed, my 29-year-old paralegal. She followed me out carrying half the boxes. "You're not quitting, right?" she asked. "I'm regrouping," I said. "There's a difference." We rented a small workspace above a bakery in Beacon Hill. It smelled like coffee and sugar, a strange comfort while the world tore at my reputation. Anna brought in an old desk from her apartment and a second-hand printer. "It's not a firm," she said, "but it's honest." I nodded, grateful for the company. Each day, I read through Henry's files, financial records, medical reports, letters he'd written in his final months. Nothing indicated impairment. He'd been lucid, logical, thorough. The only sign of confusion came from my parents who had mistaken ownership for love. One night, I sat in that small office staring at my reflection in the window. My hair was tied back, eyes ringed with exhaustion. The city lights blurred behind me. I thought about my father's words when I left home at 22. "You'll be back when life reminds you you're not special." Maybe he'd been half right. Life had reminded me I wasn't special, but Henry had reminded me I was capable. Anna glanced over her computer and said softly, "They have money, Laura. They'll drag this out until you break." I leaned back in my chair. "They have money," I said, "but I have evidence." She smiled faintly. "That's heavier." For the first time since the funeral, I believed it. I stayed up that night drafting motions, building the foundation for my defense. I wasn't just protecting an inheritance, I was defending the only person who had ever shown up. The first day of trial arrived with a sky the color of slate. The courthouse steps were lined with photographers, their camera shutters snapping like gunfire as I walked past. I didn't hide. I didn't wave. I just kept walking my gray suit pressed and simple, the same one they'd mocked. Inside the courtroom buzzed with low conversation until the bailiff called for order. I took my seat at the defense table. My parents sat across the aisle perfectly composed. Elaine wore pearls again, a small polished smirk resting on her lips. Robert leaned back, whispering something to their attorney, Gregory Sloan. He was tall, graying, with the charm of a man who'd built his career on arrogance. When Judge Margaret Keene entered, the entire room shifted. The air thickened. I stood. She glanced at me briefly. Recognition flickered in her eyes. She had served on the bench with Henry for 15 years. "You may proceed," she said. Gregory rose first. Your Honor. He began, his tone rich with false empathy. This case is about betrayal, about a young woman who took advantage of an elderly man's declining mind. The evidence will show that Laura Hayes isolated her grandfather from his family, from his friends, and from reason. I sat still taking notes as his words filled the room like smoke. He painted me as a manipulator, a self-serving lawyer who preyed on an old man's trust. When he gestured toward my parents, Elaine dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that looked rehearsed. Robert looked solemn, like a man forced to defend honor. I could almost hear Henry's voice whispering, "Don't interrupt noise with noise. Let silence weigh heavier." When it was my turn, I stood slowly. Your Honor. I began keeping my tone measured. This case is not about influence. It's about presence. For 6 years I was there. When Henry Hayes was ill, I drove him to appointments. When he couldn't sleep, I stayed up and read to him. When he fell, I lifted him. My parents were in Paris. The courtroom fell silent. I could feel their anger rising behind me. I continued. The evidence will show that Henry Hayes was of sound mind when he made his decisions, and that those decisions were based not on persuasion, but on gratitude. Gregory objected to nearly every sentence, his voice sharp. Judge Keene sustained some overruled others, but her eyes never left me. Proceed, she said once, softly but firmly, after an objection meant to rattle me. I did. I laid out our first exhibit, a series of signed medical evaluations, confirming Henry's cognitive stability. Gregory leaned on his table, smirking. You expect us to believe doctors can't be manipulated, he said. Your Honor, opposing counsel seems to think every medical professional in Boston was part of a conspiracy, I replied. A few people chuckled quietly. Even the stenographer hid a smile. Keene lifted a brow. Mr. Sloane, stay on track. My father shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being corrected in public. I watched his jaw tighten. Every word felt like stitching torn fabric back together, slow, precise, deliberate. The session dragged for hours. Gregory tried to paint Henry as frail dependent, confused. I countered with hospital records, dates, emails, letters. My mother avoided my gaze, but her hand trembled when she adjusted her necklace. My father pretended not to see. By the afternoon recess, my throat burned from speaking. Outside the courtroom, Anna handed me water. They're circling, she said. I know. Then circle back harder. I smiled faintly. I plan to. The next morning, Gregory introduced a witness, a former nurse from Henry's early recovery period. She claimed I'd kept visitors away. Is it true you discouraged family visits? Gregory asked. No, I said evenly. I discouraged empty gestures. The audience murmured. Gregory smiled like he'd expected that. Ah, so you admit controlling access. I admit protecting his peace. He paced closer. Would you call yourself his caretaker or his gatekeeper? His witness, I answered. The room went still. Even the judge paused her writing. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something like approval in her expression. Move on, Mr. Sloane, she said. The trial adjourned late that day. As people filed out, I saw my mother whisper something to my father. He didn't look back, but I caught the way her eyes shifted toward me, uneasy, uncertain, as though she'd seen a crack form in the wall they'd built. I gathered my files, exhausted but grounded. Outside, the autumn air felt sharper, colder, more honest. Anna walked beside me. How do you think it went? She asked. I looked up at the gray sky. They think I'm losing, I said quietly. That's the best position to be in. The third week of trial began with a storm. The courthouse windows rattled rain streaking down the glass, like the walls themselves were weeping. Gregory called my mother to the stand. She looked immaculate as always, cream blouse, pearl earrings, hands folded neatly in her lap. When she took the oath, she even smiled at the judge, the same way she used to smile at cameras at charity galas. Gregory began softly. Mrs. Hayes, tell the court about your relationship with your father. He was everything to me, she said, voice quivering perfectly on cue. But after Laura moved in, things changed. Calls went unanswered. He stopped visiting. She poisoned him against us. Poisoned. The word landed like acid. Gregory nodded sympathetically. How often did you see your father in his final years? Not as often as I wanted, she whispered. Laura made that difficult. Difficult how she wouldn't return my calls. She told him I was too stressful for his health. She controlled everything who could visit what he read, even what he believed. Gregory turned dramatically toward the judge. So you're saying your father's will doesn't reflect his true intentions? No, it doesn't, Elaine said firmly. My father adored me. He would never cut me out unless someone manipulated him. Gregory smiled, satisfied. No further questions. My attorney, an old colleague of Henry's named Denise Calder, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, built for surgical precision, rose for the cross. Mrs. Hayes, she began, voice calm, deliberate. You testified that your father adored you. How often did you see him the year before his death? I don't recall. Once, maybe twice. According to his calendar, once on his 88th birthday for 45 minutes. Does that sound right? He wasn't well. You left before cake. Denise interrupted smoothly. You claimed Laura kept you away. But can you show a single email message or call where you were denied contact? Elaine hesitated. It wasn't written. So no proof. I didn't keep records. Denise flipped open a folder. Your father did. In fact, he documented every call you missed and every month he sent you money. Would you like to read the totals? Elaine's face drained of color. No, over $800,000, Mrs. Hayes. Over 2 decades. Does that sound like a man being kept away from his daughter? Elaine's voice cracked. He wanted to help. He wanted to believe you'd change, Denise said quietly. But instead, you're here suing the only person who actually showed up. Silence swallowed the courtroom. Elaine's composure crumbled. She dabbed her eyes, but the tears this time looked real. Denise didn't gloat. She simply nodded to the judge and said, no further questions. Gregory called my father next. Robert strutted to the stand like it was a board meeting. He didn't bother swearing on the Bible. He just said I do like it was an inconvenience. Gregory asked him about Henry's mental state. Declining, Robert said. He was forgetful, he repeated himself. He wasn't making rational decisions. Did you express concern? Yes, but Laura cut us off. Did he ever show confusion in your presence all the time? He once asked me how my mother was. She's been dead for years. Gregory looked smug. No further questions. Denise stood. Mr. Hayes, you said your father was confused. Did you have medical qualifications to assess that? No, but I knew him. You also knew he was giving you monthly checks. Robert stiffened. That was family support. Support for what exactly? Business investments. Such as Denise unfolded a sheet, a sports bar that closed in 11 months, a fitness app that never launched, a property venture that defaulted. Your father documented each bailout. How many times did you repay him? That's irrelevant. It's entirely relevant. You testified he was incompetent. Yet he was competent enough to sign your loan guarantees and rescue you from bankruptcy 3 times. Is that correct? Robert's jaw tightened. He didn't know what he was doing. You mean he didn't know he was helping you? Denise asked. No, he didn't know he was being manipulated. By whom? By her. He pointed at me, eyes sharp with hatred. She made him believe I was a failure. Did you need help believing that? Denise asked almost kindly. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Robert's face turned red. You have no right. You had every right to visit him. Mr. Hayes, Denise said, voice rising slightly. But you didn't. You had every right to care for him, to call, to show up. But you didn't. Instead, you took his money and disappeared until he died. And now you call that love? Robert slammed his hand on the stand. He was senile, he shouted. He was blind. That old man ruined me. The judge's gavel cracked. Mr. Hayes, control yourself. He sank back into the chair, breathing hard. The damage was done. His mask had slipped. Denise walked back to the defense table slowly, deliberately. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom stayed silent for several seconds. Even Gregory looked uneasy. When the judge finally spoke, her tone was colder than rain. We'll adjourn for the day. I didn't move. I couldn't. Watching my father unravel under oath felt like watching a mirror shatter years of intimidation collapsing into fragments of rage and self-pity. As I stood, I caught Elaine's eyes. There was no fire left, only something like defeat. Outside, reporters swarmed asking if I felt vindicated. I didn't answer. Vindication was too small a word for what this was. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about record, about the truth finally being documented in black and white, where no one could rewrite it. Anna caught up with me at the steps. "He cracked," she said. "They both did." I looked at the storm clouds parting over the Charles River. "No," I said quietly. "They revealed who they've always been. The court just gave them a microphone." The final day of trial arrived with a sky so bright it almost felt cruel. No rain, no wind, just sunlight cutting through the courthouse windows like it wanted everything exposed. The gallery was packed reporters, former colleagues of Henry's, even two of his old clerks who nodded at me when I entered. I took my seat beside Denise, who handed me a glass of water. "Whatever happens," she said, "you did him proud." I believed her. I wanted to. Gregory gave his closing argument first, walking slow, and measured his voice, a blend of honey and poison. "Your Honor," he said, "this case isn't about greed, it's about grief. Two parents left out of a will by their daughter's influence. Two people denied a father's love because one granddaughter inserted herself between them. We don't dispute that Judge Hayes was brilliant. But brilliance doesn't make one immune to manipulation." He turned toward me, lowering his voice. "Love can cloud reason. And Miss Hayes, well, she was the only one around to write the narrative." His gaze swept to my parents. Elaine dabbed her eyes again. Robert held her hand as though rehearsed. Gregory faced the judge. "We ask that you restore fairness, that you return this estate to its rightful heirs, not to the architect of its theft." When he sat, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Denise rose slowly. She didn't pace. She didn't gesture. She simply stood straight and let the silence stretch until even the judge leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor," she began softly, "the plaintiffs have spoken about love, about grief, about what's fair. But what's fair isn't determined by who cries the loudest. It's determined by evidence, and the evidence is clear." She gestured to the table piled with exhibits. For 3 decades, Henry Hayes documented everything: the money he gave his daughter, the visits that never happened, the birthdays missed, the calls unanswered. He did what judges do, he kept records, because he knew someday truth might need witnesses, and now those records speak louder than any accusation. Denise's voice steadied. "They say presence matters. They say loyalty counts. They say this granddaughter did not manipulate a dying man, she honored a living one, and in return, he honored her back. That's not exploitation, that's love." She paused, looking at me briefly before finishing. "Your Honor, this case is about a simple question: who showed up? The answer is in every calendar entry, every receipt, every photo, every Sunday dinner. It's Laura Hayes. The defendant asks only that this court do what her grandfather would have done: choose truth over noise." She sat down. I realized I'd been holding my breath. Judge Keene's ruling came after a long recess. When she returned, the courtroom rose, then fell into absolute stillness. She adjusted her glasses, her tone firm but calm. "This case has been painful. Family cases always are. They blur the line between emotion and fact. But the court's duty is not to heal families, it is to weigh evidence." She turned to my parents. "The plaintiffs allege undue influence and incapacity. After reviewing all exhibits and testimony, I find no medical evidence of cognitive decline. To the contrary, Judge Hayes was deliberate, precise, and entirely aware of his decisions." She looked directly at me. "He took great care in preparing his estate to reflect gratitude, not obligation." Elaine's hand gripped Robert's. The judge continued. "The claim of manipulation fails. The evidence shows that Laura Hayes provided consistent care, companionship, and support while the plaintiffs remained largely absent. That is not undue influence. That is reality." My chest tightened. The judge's voice lowered. "The court therefore upholds the will as written. Furthermore, given the baseless nature of this claim, and the emotional and financial damage inflicted upon the defendant, the plaintiffs are ordered to pay the defendant's legal costs and a penalty for malicious prosecution. The gavel came down. Sharp. Final. Robert muttered something under his breath too low for the record, but loud enough for me to catch one word: ungrateful. Elaine sobbed quietly, not from grief, but humiliation. The cameras flashed as the courtroom dissolved into noise, reporters whispering pins, scratching doors creaking open. Denise touched my arm. "It's done," she said softly. "It's over." But it didn't feel over. Not yet. I looked at my parents across the aisle. My father refused to meet my eyes. My mother's tears streaked her makeup. They looked smaller somehow, like two people finally standing without the scaffolding of entitlement holding them up. The bailiff announced adjournment, but no one moved for several seconds. Finally, I rose. The sound of my heels on the marble floor echoed through the chamber. When I passed by them, Elaine whispered, "Laura, please wait." I turned calm, almost detached. "You called me a manipulator," I said quietly. "You accused me of stealing from the man who raised me. You tried to bury his name in lies." She shook her head, trembling. "We were angry. We didn't know what he was thinking." "He was thinking clearly," I said. "For once, someone in this family was." Robert started to speak, but the bailiff's stare cut him off. "You think this makes you noble?" he spat. "You've destroyed your family." I leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't destroy anything. You did when you stopped showing up." Then I walked out. Reporters surged forward on the courthouse steps, shouting questions. "Miss Hayes, how does it feel to win? Will you forgive your parents?" Was this about justice or money? I stopped at the top of the steps. "Justice," I said simply and kept walking. The cameras flashed again, but I didn't look back. That night, I visited Henry's grave for the first time since the trial began. The grass was still wet from the morning rain. I knelt brushing leaves off the headstone. "It's done," I whispered. "They tried to rewrite you, but the truth held." The city lights shimmered faintly through the trees. "You were right about one thing, Grandpa. The law isn't blind, it just takes the right eyes to see it." I sat there until the moon rose, until the noise in my head finally went quiet. Justice had been served. But the cost of it, losing the illusion of family, losing the last strands of hope that maybe they'd change, would take longer to accept. Yet as I stood to leave, I realized something simple and solid. I hadn't lost Henry. His voice lived in my every decision. His legacy wasn't the house or the fund. It was the principle that truth once spoken cannot be buried. The verdict hit the headlines within hours. "Judge's granddaughter triumphs over greedy heirs," one read. "Justice served in Hayes family feud," said another. The photos were everywhere. My calm face walking down the courthouse steps contrasted with my father's red, furious one. Reporters replayed the trial clips on local and national stations, dissecting every line of testimony, every tremor in Elaine's voice. For the first time, the world saw what I'd lived with my whole life, a family obsessed with image, not integrity. My parents went silent for a week. Then came their counterstrike. Elaine gave an interview on a morning talk show, sitting perfectly framed by soft lighting and sympathy. "We just wanted fairness," she said, eyes glistening. "Our daughter." She turned her back on us. We were grieving. The host leaned forward. "And the will." "It was a misunderstanding," Elaine murmured. "We only wanted transparency." The segment went viral, but not in their favor. The comment section was brutal. Viewers posted clips from the courtroom comparing her performance on TV to her testimony under oath. One wrote, "Ma'am, you weren't grieving, you were scheming." Another, "She's crying because she lost, not because she cared." By evening, sponsors quietly dropped their social charity foundation, and Robert's firm began internal reviews on misuse of company funds. They called me the next day. I didn't answer. The voicemail from my father was curt, defensive, the same tone he used in business negotiations. "Laura, we're being harassed by the media. You've made this worse than it needed to be. Call us so we can handle it privately." He still thought everything could be managed reputation over reflection. I deleted the message. Anna came by that night with takeout. She sat on my couch balancing noodles and wine, watching the news coverage replay on mute. "You realize," she said between bites, "you've become the symbol of poetic justice in half the city." I laughed a tired sound. I didn't plan to. I just wanted the truth on record. That's why it worked, she said. You didn't perform it, you lived it. But victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like silence finally replacing noise. I spent the next few days sorting Henry's files, the old chess scores, the handwritten notes in the margins of legal books, the faded tulip drawings he'd left tucked inside a folder labeled Legacy. He'd once written, "Justice isn't about punishment, it's about record." I understood it now more than ever. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the court clerk, an official certification that the Henry Hayes Justice Fund was now fully transferred to my management. It included a note Henry had written years ago to accompany the documents, "Don't let power turn kind people quiet." I held it for a long time thinking about what he'd built and what my parents had tried to destroy. Then I made my first decision as director. I announced a scholarship program for law students specializing in elder rights and family estate law. Within hours, applications poured in. The first donation came anonymously, $10,000 wired from an account with no name but a single word in the memo, Michael. I stared at it stunned. My brother hadn't said a word throughout the trial, hadn't appeared once. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was an apology. Or maybe it was what Henry had meant when he said justice isn't loud. Outside, the city glowed beneath early winter light. The air smelled like frost and coffee. For the first time in months, I opened the window wide and let the cold rush in. Justice had been served in court, but peace. Peace would take longer. Still, it had begun. Spring came early that year. The first tulips bloomed outside the courthouse steps, yellow and quiet, the same color Henry had always planted in his garden. I passed them one morning on my way to a meeting with the board of the Justice Fund, and for the first time since the verdict, I didn't feel anger tighten my chest, just stillness, a kind of fragile peace. That afternoon, I received a letter without a return address. The handwriting was uneven, almost shaky. I knew it instantly, my mother's cursive precise, even when her heart wasn't. The letter inside was short, only 3 paragraphs. "Laura," it began, "I know I've lost the right to ask for your time, but silence feels heavier than guilt. Your father hasn't been the same since the verdict. He says nothing, just sits in the study for hours. Maybe this is punishment enough. I wanted to tell you I'm sorry not for losing, but for not seeing you when it mattered. I hope someday you find something good in the wreckage of us. Love, Mom." I read it twice, the second time slower. It wasn't an apology that fixed anything, but it wasn't hollow either. I placed it in the same folder as Henry's notes, not to forgive, but to remember. Some truths deserve to stay preserved, not erased. A week later, Michael called. His voice was hesitant, quieter than I remembered. "I heard about the scholarship," he said. "It's good what you're doing." I asked how he'd known. "I sent something," he said. "Anonymous. Guess it wasn't as anonymous as I thought." I smiled faintly. "You didn't have to." "I did," he said, "because I watched them turn you into the villain for years, and I let them. I thought keeping peace meant keeping quiet, but it just made me a coward." There was a long pause before I said, "Then start by not being one anymore." He exhaled a small broken sound. "I'm trying." That night, I visited Henry's house for the first time since inheriting it. The dust had settled on the furniture, the air thick with memory. I walked through each room slowly, touching the edges of his books, the brass lamp by his chair, the chessboard still mid-game. One queen missing mine. He'd been winning that last match, but left it unfinished. On the desk, I found a sealed envelope I hadn't noticed before tucked inside a drawer, my name written in his handwriting. Inside a note, "If they ever try to undo what's right, remember this. Justice isn't vengeance. It's memory made permanent. Don't let their guilt become your prison. Forgive, but don't return." I sat in that old chair and cried for the first time in months, not for loss, but for release. Henry hadn't left me instructions, he'd left me permission. Permission to stop proving my worth to people who would never see it. By summer, my parents sold their house. Rumor said they were moving south, away from the city that no longer respected the name they'd spent decades polishing. I didn't attend their farewell gathering, though an invitation arrived. I sent flowers instead, yellow tulips, a single line on the card, for presence, not performance. The next morning, I received an email from a law student, one of the first recipients of the fund's scholarship. She wrote, "Your story made me believe good people can win without losing their kindness." I closed my laptop, looked out at the blooming garden, and whispered, "That's all he ever wanted." For the first time, I believed it wasn't just justice that had survived, it was legacy. 2 years later, the city felt different. The courthouse no longer made my pulse quicken when I walked past. The whispers had faded, replaced by nods of respect from clerks and lawyers who once avoided eye contact. The Henry Hayes Justice Fund had grown faster than I imagined: 12 scholarships, 4 active cases defending elderly clients against financial exploitation, and a mentorship program for young attorneys who believed law should still mean something. Every Friday afternoon, I taught a short seminar at the university titled Ethics in Inheritance Law. My students were mostly first-generation lawyers, curious and hungry. Their notebooks filled with the same ideals I once scribbled in mine. Sometimes they asked about my grandfather, how it felt to represent his legacy. I always said the same thing. He didn't give me his name. He gave me his standards. After class, I'd walk home through Beacon Hill, where the air still carried faint traces of coffee and rain. My apartment remained small, deliberately so. I'd kept it that way to remind myself what silence cost and what it built. On the wall hung a single photograph, Henry and me at the kitchen table chessboard between us, his hand mid-move. Below it, the caption engraved on a small brass plate read, "Justice is patience in action." Michael visited sometimes now. He'd changed, working at a nonprofit legal clinic upstate, married quieter. We didn't talk about the trial anymore. We didn't need to. Once, while helping me carry boxes of files, he stopped in front of the photo and said softly, "You look like him when you think." I laughed. "That's a compliment." "Yeah," he said, "it is." A few months later, I received a notice from the clerk's office, a request for a guest lecture at the annual Judicial Ethics Conference. The theme, Inheritance and Integrity. I hesitated, then accepted. On the day of the event, I stood behind the podium under the same vaulted ceilings where my parents had once watched me from the gallery. The lights were softer now, the air less heavy. "My grandfather taught me that justice isn't decided in noise," I began. "It's decided in what you can still stand by when the noise fades. We think inheritance means property, but it's really presence, what we leave behind and how we showed up for people." I paused, seeing heads nod across the hall. "The law remembers what we record, but people remember what we do. Henry Hayes taught me both." When the applause came, it wasn't loud, it was steady, like rain returning to a roof you'd learned to trust again. Afterward, an older judge approached me, gray hair, kind eyes. "You remind me of him," she said. "He'd be proud." "Thank you," I replied, "but I think he'd be prouder that the work continues." That evening, I walked to the cemetery with a single yellow tulip in my hand. The sun was setting low, gold spilling across the stones. I knelt by Henry's grave, tracing his name with my thumb. "It's quieter now," I said softly. They moved away. "Michael's doing better, and the fund's growing." I smiled faintly. "You were right. Justice endures." The wind shifted, rustling through the grass. Somewhere nearby, church bells chimed 6 o'clock, the same hour we used to play chess. I placed the tulip down and whispered, "Presence defines love," the phrase he'd written 1,000 times, the one that had carried me through every silence. As I stood to leave, I looked back one last time. The city lights flickered beyond the hill, warm and distant. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the daughter who'd been mocked in a courtroom or the granddaughter who'd had to defend her own name. I just felt seen. Because the verdict had silenced them, but truth quiet and enduring had spoken for me ever since.